So we've been talking a little bit about active record, which is a big part of the implementation of models in the Rails version of Model View Controller. And the next couple of things we're going to do, we're going to look at how active record is used to create new data. We already sort of saw how you use it to find data that exists, and I sort of told you to take it on faith that we will show you how that data got there in the first place. So how you use it to create data, how you use it to update existing data, and then, importantly, how that gets glued to the controller and the view portions, and how those three things work together. So the next few segments here are really going to be doing a deep dive on that trip through a Rails application and seeing at the level of individual lines of code what's going on there and how do these pieces, how do these moving parts all go together. So let's take a look at creating in Active Record. And now we're going to switch to live demo mode. Okay, so I'm continuing with this silly little demo app that I created. And by the way, you could probably create this demo app using an LLM. I actually did it more or less by hand, because I'm old school that way. And just like in our previous session, rather than starting up the server right away, I'm going to open a Rails console, which is like a read eval print loop. It's a REPL, but with all of Rails and all of your app code loaded into it. And I'm going to use this to show how you use Active Record to create new data. And remember, we're still using a database that has a few movies in it. We're going to get to how they got there. But for now, I'm going to start by, so how do I call create? I just pass a hash of the attributes. It's a class method. And remember that in a Rails app, all of the models inherit from this very powerful class application controller, about which we will have more to say in just a little bit. And that inheritance gives them a bunch of magical properties, like the ability to do all of the CRUD operations on themselves backed by the database. And in particular, for creating, I just pass a hash of the parameters I want. Here's a movie I really have been looking forward to seeing, and I just missed it at the Alamo Drafthouse. Well, that appeared to do something. I didn't get a bad error message. And indeed, I can say something like, if folks remember that the last time we did a demo, we used where. And once again, I'm going to pass a hash. So basically anything that matches these criteria. And that looks pretty good. And in fact, I can even pretty print it to see sort of a nicely formatted. Oh, and I didn't specify a release date, so that stayed nil. Okay, a couple of things to point out before we go on. I could also have done, let's try creating another one. Okay, punctuation-wise, what's different between this statement that I'm about to hit return on and the first one that I did? And why is it okay? No curly braces, and that's okay because, remember when we talked about Ruby, there's a number of punctuations that can be optional in Ruby, like you don't need to put parens around the function arguments if there aren't, if it's obvious from the parsing how it's going to go. In fact, if you're calling a function with no arguments, you don't even have to put the empty parens around it like you would, for example, in Python or in JavaScript. And in a similar vein, if you're passing a hash as one of the parameters to a function call, you can omit the curly braces if it's otherwise obvious. So what would be an example of when it is not otherwise obvious? Say you have a function that expects 2 arguments, and both of those arguments are hashes. In that case, there would be sort of no way to tell where the first one ends and the second one begins. So in that case, you would have to put the braces in. But it's very common, especially in cases like this, where the function expects a single argument that is a hash, to just leave out the braces, right? And I want to make sure that people understand that this isn't a special syntax or something like that. This is just generally, in Ruby, you can omit the braces around a hash when you're passing it to a function if there's no ambiguity about where those braces would have gone.
Yeah, if you've used the KW-args syntax in Python, where you basically just take a dictionary as the final argument, Ruby is a little bit more flexible in that if you have multiple, think of them sort of as multiple named arguments is the way to sort of treat them.
Okay.
So it's conceptually similar.
And so this appeared to work, but there's more than one way. So remember, we talked a lot about this duality between there's objects in memory and there's objects in the database. And it's not the case that when you update one of those, the other one somehow magically gets updated, but Active Record provides the connective glue that lets you do that explicitly. So in particular, another way that I can create an instance of a model is I can call movie.new. And in fact, I can call it without any arguments at all. And what I get is essentially an empty version of that object. It's an object whose attributes all have their default values, which in this case is that they're nil. And now I can go through and assign the attributes one at a time, because remember, the attribute getters and setters, as defined by active record and by the application record class that we're inheriting from, are not just setting some underlying instance variable, right? They're doing something to the in-memory copy of the object such that when we save it to the database, these fields will all go into the correct database columns. So I think that's probably right. And now we can call save. And I got back true. Yay, which means it worked. If I get back a truthy value from save, all went well. And we'll discuss later what to do when not everything goes well. So until the moment that I said save, the new active record model that I had created existed only in memory. Save is essentially a way of saying, okay, it's ready. This is the version you want to store in the database. So I've shown you two different ways to get something into the database. You can say new, and then you can assign attributes one at a time, or in fact, you could even give the attributes the same way as you would for create. That gives you just an in-memory copy, and then you can separately save it later. Or you can say create, which really just sort of combines new and save into a single operation. If you already know all the attributes, you can use that. Either way is fine, and we're going to show examples of both. What's the sort of high order bit here? You can use new followed by save, or you can use create. There's also, like in a lot of Rails calls, there's a save bang version, save exclamation mark. The only difference is that instead of returning a falsy value if things go wrong, it raises an exception. And there's cases where you actually want to do that. And once the object is created, it acquires a primary key. If you remember when we said, this abstraction of things are stored in database tables, in the world of databases, every object in a table has to have a primary key. That is a value that is considered immutable. Once the object is created, its primary key generally does not ever change. And in the Ruby side, there isn't really a corresponding thing that plays that role. You don't sort of need one. So when I was creating movies, I didn't have to specify a primary key. In fact, it would be incorrect to do so because that's the database's job. The first time that it gets persisted, in other words, saved to the database and entered as a row in a table, the database will assign a primary key according to however the schema says that primary keys are assigned. And so there's actually, if you look at the ID field of the in-memory object, you can sort of tell whether the object has ever been saved. If it has an ID that's nil, it's never been saved. If it has an ID that is not nil, it has been saved at least once. And again, all of these behaviors happen because the model instances, the classes that we create for the models are all inheriting from application record, which is part of this active record package. That's what gives these models the sort of built-in behaviors to connect themselves to the database.